I've often said I owe my soul to R.S. Thomas. I was brought up in a Christian home, and I was baptised in the Church of Wales, actually, and I grew up in my early days in Wales, in Aberdaron. But because my mother wasn't very well when I was about to come onto the world stage, she got taken over the border to hospital in Shrewsbury, much to the disgust of my grandparents. I was born in England. But I do recall some of those early days in Aberdaron, sitting around the range in a post-war council house when Lloyd George was revered. Whenever the name of Winston Churchill was mentioned, my grandfather, who was a World War I veteran, would say, "Shot the miners." Yeah, so it's a very interesting, different perspective on history. Welsh was the first language in that house, but my mother married a Welshman who spoke no Welsh at all. And her mother, her first language was Welsh. She had been beaten in school for speaking Welsh in the village school because English was being imposed. I'm sure with the best intentions, and I think my mother grew up with an uncertainty around Welsh and whether it would help people to speak Welsh. So I was never taught Welsh apart from swear words, which I picked up. And that was always a sadness to me, and in some ways there's a certain resonance there with R.S. Thomas's early days, isn't there? By the time I was ready for school, we moved over the border into England to Oswestry. And Oswestry, it didn't really seem like England. Actually, what we did is move to the market town. Oswestry was really then still almost bilingual. And certainly every church, apart from the Quakers and the Roman Catholics, every church had both an English and a Welsh congregation. Even the Anglican Church, I remember, even the Church of England had in its grounds Dewi Sant, the Welsh-speaking Church of England church. And as young children, we would hear that. And we were always taught very clearly that the gospel came to our bit of the world from Iona and from Lindisfarne, and was kept safe by the Welsh saints. And that whole Augustin southern business, that wasn't really where we got the truth. So there's a fascinating upbringing. And so Croes Oswald, Oswestry, I'm in my 60s now. It still had an energy of being a Welsh. I suppose the cliche is Oswestry is the Welsh town in England. Welshpool, where my paternal grandparents lived, that's the English town in Wales. But that's the nature of the marches, that kind of linguistic interweaving and a real dynamic in those days. So I've always thought of Wilfred Owen, who was born round the corner from where I grew up, as a Welsh poet. Interestingly, at school in the 60s, Wilfred Owen wasn't talked about at all in Oswestry because it was a garrison town. So a poet who spoke his kinds of questions about war was ignored. So it's only much, much more recently that Wilfred Owen is revered in the town where he was born. But he's much more celebrated in Shrewsbury and in Birkenhead, actually. I owe R.S. Thomas my soul because when I was 15, I was a choir boy, and I was in the choir. I was in that great English-Welsh choral tradition, and I had my first crisis of faith at 15. And by chance, I picked up in the bookshop a volume of R.S. Thomas, and I began to read it, and I came across the words, into the God space I send out my probes. The New Mariner, that poem, The New Mariner. Into the God space I send out my probes. And I thought, that's suddenly what prayer has come to feel like to me. I'm not sure there is anyone there. And I think he helped me see two things. One, that you could be truly Welsh, but be creative in English. That was allowed. And the other thing was that faith is an adventure, it's a struggle, and actually doubt can be very beautiful. And God can be encountered through that whole spiritual struggle. So I owe him a great deal, I think. I received my call to ministry very early on in Welshpool Parish Church, very strangely at the age of 3.5, when I was helping my gran clean the brasses, and I wandered up to the altar, and I had a very strong, powerful sense of love and God's presence, and I oddly went home and just said, I want to be a vicar. And so my call was completely irrational. I don't know how I went from that experience of God to the sense of wanting to serve, but I did. And I always feel that R.S. Thomas, though I never met him personally, was a kind of companion, because he also showed that ministry is also an adventure. Christian discipleship is an adventure, sometimes a very rocky or lonely voyage or walk across the moors, sometimes very beautiful, sometimes very solitary, sometimes one feels abandoned, but somehow that's what the journey is. And one contribution I've made to teaching the faith and to particularly ministerial development is to use poetry as a way of reflecting on the experience of faith and of ministry. And R.S. Thomas is one of the most amazing reflectors on the practice of ministry. So his poems say, sick visits, I go back to again and again with clergy. And what comes out of that poem is amazing. And all my doctoral research has been in that area of how we use poetry. And I also use poetry with teachers, with medics, and a poem releases so many different views, and it gives permission for people to get in touch with the size of themselves, which is often clamped down. And particularly in professions where the emotions are not easily expressed, particularly say in the medical professions, a poem can be very, very liberating. But the way in which different interpretations of a poem are permitted, they're invited, that gets great professional discussions going. So I owe a great deal to R.S. Thomas. And the angle I want to take is about, in a sense, poetry and learning, or poetry and formation, how we become a believer, or how we become a professional. And I'm interested that my talk slightly changed from when Susan and I first discussed it, which was pre-COVID, so it's a couple of years ago. And I now work in Birmingham, which is very much a multicultural city, very much an interfaith city. And so I'm bringing that context slightly to bear on what I'm talking about. In 2020, an American theologian called Willie James Jennings wrote a book called After Whiteness. And he says that any learning about God must be learning about belonging. About belonging. So he questions any learning about God which is not helping people to belong, or feel included. And as a black theologian, he's critical of many of the established models of learning about God. And he says at the back of them, there's often hegemony, which is cultural domination. There's only one way of seeing God, one way of being right about God. And at the back of them, there is often homogeneity, which is one cultural form. So people are thinking in one colour, not in many colours. People are thinking in one culture, one language, one set of norms, not in a pluriformity of colours and norms. And in this sense, I think Wales is a gift to the world, and Anglo-Welshness is a gift to the world. R.S. Thomas is a gift to the world. As a Welsh priest, he wrote in English, but he uncovered so much of the truth of the faith. He wrote, spoke, painted pictures in those two colours, those two cultural norms. And that's a gift in today's world. We see what cultural domination is beginning to raise its head again when we look at Russia and the Ukraine situation. It's too resonant, isn't it, of what began in Germany in the 30s or in parts of Italy. I think Wales as a place in which, as a place of plurality, is a gift to Europe. It's a gift to the United Kingdom, and it's a gift to the world. And I celebrate R.S. Thomas for that. One theologian talks about learning the faith as being a fellowship of the unlike. A fellowship of the unlike. We must not expect all to look the same, be the same, or speak the same. Harvey Quiani, a UK African scholar, in his book, The Multicultural Kingdom, he argues that cultural diversity is always a blessing. God gives us gifts in the form of the different other who comes bearing some of what we need to thrive. God gives us gifts in the form of the different other who comes bearing gifts and gives us what we need to thrive. Diversity is God's gift to us. And David Ellis Thomas, in his preface to that wonderful selection of Welsh poets writing in English, edited by Mayak Stevens, he writes that a nation is an imagined community. A nation is an imagined community in which its people make an imaginative choice. And that this is true for Wales. There are many definitions of Wales as there are people and places in it. It's a diverse landscape. It's a diverse ecology. It's a diverse culture. And RS gives us a door into that rich ecology and culture. So I want to trace some of that interplay, that dynamic between the English and the Welsh, in which R.S. Thomas finds a place. So I'm not going to do what greater scholars than myself have done, which is to trace how R.S. Thomas references Welsh poets in his work, but more look at the landscape of, well, a little bit of the landscape of Anglo-Welsh poetry, and just help us triangulate R.S. Thomas's work by taking that big view. If you ever go to Chirk Castle, in that just near where Elsie and R.S. met, there's a wonderful point in the garden when you look not to Wales but over to the Shropshire Plain, and you can see the Brythons over to your right and the hills of Cheshire to your left, and you can see so many towns, rivers, small hills, woods before you, and there's a wonderful kind of stainless steel topographical diagram there, and you can just spot certain places, and suddenly as you spot how one place relates to another, certainly in my mind I suddenly understand those places much more. They take on a much richer understanding because I can see how they relate to others. So in a way we're kind of looking a bit this afternoon at a landscape and seeing R.S. Thomas in that landscape in relation to others. And we're going to do that just by looking at some poems together. And I'll read a few of these poems, and then I think we'll take the risk of opening it up a bit and getting your perspectives if you're happy to talk on camera. I wanted to begin with this translation, and translation is going to be very important in the set of poems. So this is a translation by Joseph Clancy, who himself was a poet, Catholic, Welsh poet writing in English, and it's of the great David, the great Welsh poet. And there are many translations of this, the Mass of the Birds, or the Mass in the Woods, and this is his, the Mass of the Grove. In a pleasant place today, mantled by fine green hazel, I listened at day's dawning to a skillful speckled thrush singing a polished stanza, smooth lessons and prophecies. The essence of discretion, love's messenger journeyed long, coming from fair Carmarthen at my golden girl's command, wordy, needing no password, to this spot, to Nentric Brook Morvydd it was who sent him, this melodious child of May. About him there were hangings, blossoms of May's precious boughs, his chasuble they seemed like, of the wind's green mantle's wings. All gold by Almighty God was the altar's canopy. I heard in glowing language a long, no faltering chant, no stumble or mumble that read gospel to the parish. On a hill of ash trees there he raised a leafy wafer, and a nightingale nearby, beautiful, slim, sweet-spoken, the brook's songstress, rang sanctus to the welkin, clear her call. The offering was lofted to heaven above the grove, worship to God our Father, a chalice of bliss and love. Such liturgy contents me, bread of birches in fair woods. So yesterday was Corpus Christi, when the church celebrates the gift of the Eucharist, the Mass, to the faithful. What a wonderful vision of the Eucharistic celebration, Mass sung by the birds, celebrated by the birds in the beautiful Cathedral of the Woods. And there's another similar poem David ap Gwilym, in praise of the thrush. Music of a thrush, clear, bright, lovable language of light, heard I under a birch tree. Yesterday all grace and glee was ever so sweet a thing, fine plaited as his whistling. Matins, he reads the lesson, a chasuble of plumage on, his cry from a grove, his bright shout over countrysides rings out. Hill prophet, maker of moods, passion's bright bard of glenwoods, every voice of the brookside sings he in his darling pride, every sweet metered love ode, every song and organ mode, competing for a true love, every catch for woman's love, preacher and reader of law, sweet and clear, inspired rapture, bard of Ovid's faultless rhyme, chief prelate mild of springtime, from his birch where lovers throng, author of the wood's bird song, merrily the glade re-echoes, rhymes and meters of love he knows. He on hazel sings so well, through cloistered trees, winged angel, hardly a bird of Eden, had by rote remembered then how to recite what headlong passion made him do with song. Interesting in both those poems how the erotic and the divine very close together in the woods. So this poem by R.S. It's from Experimenting with an Amen, 1986, A Thicket in Llŷn. And I'm just locating this poem in the landscape with those other two translations of the ancient Welsh poems and seeing how they resonate. I think some scholars, Jason Walford Davis and others, they talk about biculturality. But from my theological perspective, I'm more interested in the word interculturality. The much more dynamic interplay in the imagination of what those poems inspire in the creative. So here we are, Thicket in Llŷn. I was no tree walking, I was still. They ignored me, the birds, the migrants on their way south. They re-leafed the trees, budding them with their notes. They filtered through the boughs like sunlight, looking at me from 3 feet off, their eyes blackberry bright, not seeing me, not detaching me from the withies where I was caged and they free. They would have perched on me had I had nourishment in my fissures. As I was, they netted me in their shadows, brushed me with sound, feathering the arrows of their own bows, and were gone, leaving me to reflect on the answer to a question I had not asked. A repetition in time of the eternal I am. Say it. Don't be shy. Escape from your mortal cage in thought. Your migrations will never be over. Between two truths, there is only the mind to fly with. Navigate by such stars as are not leaves falling from life's deciduous tree, but spray from the fountain of the imagination, endlessly replenishing itself out of its own waters. So that's some form of profound encounter in the woods. The woods aren't full of leaves, as they were in Daviv, but the birds re-leaf them. And RS is captivated by what he finds. And suddenly he is like Adam back in the garden. He is a creature alongside all the other creatures. And he is reminded of I am who I am. Moses' encounter with God in the burning bush, out there in the wilderness, the countryside anyway. He's reminded of the creativity of God, the one who brings all things into being out of nothing. And so suddenly the bird's singing, and being in the presence of the bird in that little thicket of a wood, he encounters the divine reality, which is at the heart of creation, but not just at the heart of creation, at the heart of his own heart, at the heart of his imagination. And he writes, doesn't he, in his preface to that little penguin book of religious verse, which he edited, he said, he's quoting Coleridge, and he said, we as human beings are most like God when we, through our imaginations, when we create, when we write poems or draw pictures or compose music, then we are most like God. Then the divinity in us comes alive through the power of the imagination. We're creators as God is creator. So for me then, not the Eucharist there, but nevertheless a profound sense of the real presence of the divine through the birds and the woods. So that's a kind of resonance with those early Welsh poems. A couple.
Can I just interject there and just say that we had a beautiful moment this morning when I read this poem.
Oh, did you? How lovely.
Talking about the relationship between the poetry and the landscape.
How fantastic.
And so to walk down in the Darren.
Yeah, well, some people here.
That was part of.
Oh yeah. Well, I'd love to hear your responses. Just.
So we were actually the nearest we could get to a thicket. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of clearance down there. So
Yeah.
there were only a couple of places where.
Oh,
we
that's a
had
pity.
that
Yeah.
sense. And you could imagine RS being enveloped with all those, the gorse and the.
Yeah. Yes.
The blackthorn. Mostly it was the
Blackthorn. Yeah.
Going in there.
Yeah.
In a tight space.
How wonderful. Yeah.
And sitting.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to. Is anyone who was there earlier got thoughts about the poem? Were there any birds there?
Well, we thought, yes, there were martins and buzzards and not finches, not goldfinches, I think, which is probably what was here. Chipchaps.
Chipchaps. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What you said earlier, I mean, I'm a Catholic, so Pope Francis Laudate Si.
Absolutely.
The fact that we don't understand what a person or a thing's purpose is doesn't mean to say it hasn't got a purpose.
No, that's very true. And of course, Francis has helped us recover that sense of the whole creation singing out to God, which Augustine has and the Psalms have. It's not just the human voices that sing, it's the whole creation that sings. Yeah. I don't think he goes as far as the whole creation celebrates Mass, but maybe he does. Get close to it.
I just think that in my mind, as All Matters Irish U3A group, we watched Ulysses the other week, the film, which starts off, of course, with a rather unsacramental Mass.
Okay.
Not Tello Tower. But there again, you have an outsider, during
Yeah.
the program that's
Yes.
who's an outsider.
Yeah. Tony.
Yeah, just very quickly, there is an uncollected, irritatingly, piece of prose called The Thicket and Stream by RS.
Yes.
Which you'll know, where it really is a timeless moment.
Yes.
If anything, it's even more remarkable than this, but it's clearly the same experience, and uniquely he likes to them twice.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. I noted down that year in. Oh, is that the same as the year in clean, or is that something different? But I'd got a quote here by him. He says, "It's lovely." No, this is actually watching the birds by the coast. It's lovely sometimes to spend an hour or two, go out onto the rocky. Is it Bryce Pulch? Is that right? Bryce Pulch. Watching the birds go by and comparing, waiting for a migrant bird, waiting for the vision of God. But that's not quite the same, is it? Because you're thinking of the thicket, aren't you? Yeah.
He goes in
Yeah.
to the thicket and
Yeah.
birds all around him.
Yeah.
Sometimes
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
As I say, he goes out of himself. It's like Eliot.
Yes.
It's a moment out of time, and then he comes back.
Yes, that's wonderful. And I love that sense that he's back in Eden. You know, and there's that amazing bit, isn't there, in Mark's Gospel where Jesus goes out into the desert, and there's this one phrase, he says, "And he was with the wild beasts." And that's going back. He's the new Adam. He's the new Adam. Yeah.
One of the other poems that I read this morning, first thing, was In Deep Waters. I read it in the context of the Swanland ship that sank just off from Barty back in November 2011, and there were 5 Russians who lost
Okay.
their life there. And in Great Waters, he speaks about God being there on the bottom of the sea, that the broken spars of the trawler are as the cross,
Right.
that the light acts as a chalice.
Yeah.
Or the light is the wine
Yeah.
in the chalice,
Yeah.
and the bread breaking,
Yeah.
and one can imagine the way
Yeah.
the seabed is moving
Yeah.
and crumbling, and that is the bread. And he says, and God is here also.
Yeah, that's
But
interesting.
and that that God ministers
Yeah.
to those men who fell
Yeah.
down the precipice.
Yeah. And as you talk, you're making me think of Jeremy Hopkins and the name of the poem's gone. Wreck of the Deutschland, and that sense of the drowning as consummation of the nuns. There's another. I don't know. Does Jeremy Hopkins count as an Anglo-Welsh poet? I think we can.
RS was a great family.
Yeah. So there's a resonation there with that.
Oh, yeah.
With that poem, yeah. Well, look, here are a couple more, and again, it's this sense of the encounter in the rural, and again, I think translation. So this interculturality, this third space between the Welsh and the English in the translated poem. There's this idea of the translated poem as a third space. And here, this one by Saunders Lewis, Ascension Thursday. What's going on in the hills this May morning? Look at it all, the gold of the broom and the burnham, the shoulders of the thorn tree bright with its surplus, the ready emerald of grass, the quiet calves. The chestnut trees have their candlesticks alight, hedgerows are kneeling, the birch is still as a nun. The cuckoo's 2 notes over the hush of bright streams, and a ghost mist bending away from the mead's censer. Before the rabbits scatter, O man, come forth from your council houses, come and with the weasel, see the earth lift up an immaculate wafer, and the Father kiss the Son in the white dew. So again, this idea of the countryside celebrating the Mass, the sun rising as the host, and it's like this is Teilhard de Chardin, the Mass of the universe, and the poet is glimpsing this. And then a translation by Rowan Williams of Anne Griffiths' kind of exquisite poem, I Saw Him Standing. So again, in the orchard, possibly, or in the woods, it's this vision of the risen Christ. I saw him standing. Under the dark trees, there he stands, there he stands. Shall he not draw my eyes? I thought I knew a little how he compels beyond all things, but now he stands there in the shadows. It will be, oh, such a daybreak, such bright morning, when I shall wake to see him as he is. He is called Rose of Sharon, for his skin is clear, his skin is flushed with blood, his body lovely and exact. How he compels beyond 10,000 rivals. There he stands, my friend, the friend of guilt and helplessness, to steer my hollow body over the sea. The earth is full of masks and fetishes. What is there here for me? Are these like him? Keep company with him and you will know no kin, no likeness to those empty eyes. He is a stranger to them all, great Jesus. What is there here for me? I know what I have longed for, him to hold me always. So of course there she is, Mary Magdalene in the garden. And the risen Christ comes to her. Again, a very erotic vision of the beauty of the risen Christ. Again, that resonance with the beauty of God in creation and the erotic. And of course, a longing, a kind of erotic longing, spiritual erotic longing for death. And for the resurrection encounter for herself. I don't know how those two strike you.
Sorry, no, please, I'll follow you.
No, go ahead. No.
I'm just struck by Anne Griffiths. The earth is full of masks and fetishes, you know? And then contrast that with Saunders Lewis. Saunders Lewis is a Catholic, yeah? A Welsh Catholic.
Yes.
And then jump back to what you inquired provocatively of Manly Hopkins. Well, Manly Hopkins in his 3 years in the Vale of Clwyd, he did learn some Welsh. He found a Welsh female Catholic, rare, in the Vale of Clwyd. Her brother was the priest in Caernarfon, a Welsh-speaking Catholic. And then he goes to, help me now with my terminology, who is the principal in St. Benos in the seminary in the 1870s?
Oh, I don't know the name. Oh, would it be the superior?
The superior.
Yeah.
So he goes to the superior and asks, should I learn Welsh? And he said, what, only if you want to convert them. Yeah, full stop. Yeah. But some of us embrace Hopkins because of that engagement with Haned and the Welsh.
Yeah. The rhythms and of the language and
and they're not even Welsh, are they? They are the energies of the ecology of place and space.
Yeah.
But I was much struck by Anne Griffiths as a good chapel lady.
Yes.
No fetishes. No
Yes.
masks.
Yeah.
Whereas our beloved Saunders Lewis as well, it's the surplice, it's the nun, it is the characterization of another style of belief.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think you placed them beautifully there.
Yeah. It's exciting, isn't it? You know.
Just to register, of course, that Anne Griffiths was one of RS's heroes.
Yes, and he's got a beautiful poem on her, hasn't he?
One of the few Anne Griffiths.
Yeah.
The late poem, Welsh airs, where he actually cites, interesting, refers to this. I'm going to talk tomorrow about an unpublished poem by RS, and he directly alludes to this.
this song of hers. Yeah. Yeah. The myrtles. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I can't, because I got a number of translations which I could have used, and so I can't, probably it's Tony Conran. I think he keeps myrtles. Yeah. 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 No, there is that exquisite poem. So we touched on this a little earlier. Sea watching, and again, this is a sense of what the bird or the birds evoke, and the encounter with the bird or the non-encounter with the bird, how that becomes the occasion of encounter with the spiritual, and of course, you know that the whole spirituality of absence, and that whole sense here of desert, and of the desert fathers and mothers, and the whole ascetical struggle, really, with to locate God. And in response to Tony, I just read that quote from him where he described in prose about this. But it's the landscape, the birds, the creatures, and what this evokes in terms of the spiritual journey. So it's a famous poem, but I think it's interesting to locate it in terms of these other encounters with the natural. So sea watching. Grey waters, vast as an area of prayer that one enters. Daily over a period of years, I have let the eye rest on them. Was I waiting for something? Nothing but that continuous waving that is without meaning occurred. Ah, but a rare bird is rare. It is when one is not looking, at times when one is not there, that it comes. You must wear out your eyes as others their knees. I became the hermit of the rocks, habited with the wind and the mist. There were days so beautiful the emptiness it might have filled. Its absence was as its presence, not to be told any more, so single my mind after its long fast, my watching from praying. So I just find fascinating the comparison of the encounter of the real presence, the Eucharistic presence in the creation of the birds in the woods, and the absent presence, or the present absence of the divine as he looks at the seascape and waits for the rare bird. And to me, it seems they're in the same. Well, he uses this term, doesn't he? The fountain of the imagination. And these are splashes of that same fountain. And of course, that phrase itself is John of the Cross, and the Holy Spirit is a fountain in the night that runs. So this is also the work of the Spirit. Unseen, heard, felt. Again, two more about encounter in landscape. Again, they're well known, both about moorland. I don't know whether you read these this morning. No, you went on the moors, but
We haven't got any more.
no. The moor. It was like a church to me. I entered it on soft foot, breath held like a cap in the hand. It was quiet. What God was there made himself felt, not listened to, in clean colours that brought a moistening of the eye, in movement of the wind over grass. There were no prayers said, but stillness of the heart's passions, that was praise enough, and the mind's session of its kingdom. I walked on, simple and poor, while the air crumbled and broke on me generously as bread. Eucharistic, the air crumbles generously as bread. But God is absent. No words, no logical thoughts. It's the imagination, it's the soul that senses. Moorland. It is beautiful and still, the air rarefied as the interior of a cathedral, expecting a presence. It is where also the Harrier occurs, materializing from nothing, snow soft, but with claws of fire, quartering the bare earth for the prey that escapes it, hovering over the incipient scream, here a moment, then not here, like my belief in God. Again, a translation from the Welsh by the Anglican priest poet Eurus Bowen, and this is again the Eucharist or the Eucharistic celebration of the whole creation, and this does resonate with Pope Francis. And I was bold enough to read this to 150 Catholic nuns when we were looking at Laudate Si together, and I went straight to this poem actually, because I thought, how can I talk about the Pope's views to 150 nuns? There's nothing else to do but read them a poem, and you'll perhaps see why. And they loved this poem. So you'll know, but in case you don't, reredos, that's the screen behind the altar, and this is Eurus Bowen reflecting on celebrating the Eucharist. And it's in the old style, which R.S. Thomas would have liked. So say we were in a church now, this is the east end. The priest would have been facing east, and probably looking through a glass window, because the churches weren't rich enough mainly to have stained glass. So he'd be looking through a glass window out into the countryside beyond, rather than the modern rite where we'd all be round the table together, so to speak. He'd be looking out, looking through the window. Reredos. The reredos was not an ecclesiastical adornment of symbols, but plain glass, with the danger of distracting the celebrant from the properties of the communion table. For in the translucence, the green earth budded in the morning view, the river was in bloom, the air a joyous flight, and the sunshine set the cloud ablaze. And I noticed the priest's eyes, as it were unconsciously, placing his hand on these gifts, as though these were the bread and the wine. So the vision of the celebrant moves from the bread and the wine on the holy table to the whole world outside the church. So again, this resonance with the earlier tradition. Any thoughts? Yeah. Contributions, not interruption.
This to me absolutely speaks know that St Myries is where RS continued to worship and to lead worship after he finished in his ministry. He would drive the Keating sisters, pack them all into his little Austin A7 and take them up to St Myries. The Keating sisters, by the way, were the owners of the who gave him and Elsie the lease on their retirement home. And this is so resonant as well of that poem, The View from the Window, which speaks about God as an artist, where the paint never dries, and there is constant movement, but it looks like a landscape painting. And it was really struck here, Eros Bowen has used, and the sunshine set the cloud ablaze, and RS talks about the sunlight healing the cloud's bruises. So RS takes it where you've got the black clouds, the cloud bruises, and the sun will heal them and make them disappear. So
that's beautiful.
Reference there to how the sun and the clouds work in relationship.
It's a very evocative poem, isn't it? And I feel it really resonates with Pope Francis's teachings on the creation and how the whole creation sings to God. Yeah, please.
Just a little thing. I've been able to take services in 2 crematoria that have huge plate glass windows.
Oh, yeah.
That look out on the most dramatic scenery.
Yes.
And to me, there is nothing more hopeful than to be able to look out on continuing life.
Yes.
At a time like that.
Yes.
I wish it were more so.
Yeah.
The one I've recently had to take was in Bradford, and it's just brick walls, and it's not the same.
I often think that on Barmouth Beach when I walk along and I see that very splendid church with, I think, wasn't it, the Lee and Perrins fortune built for the citizens of Barmouth. And it's a very, very splendid stone church, but it has no relationship with the view at all. And I think if Mrs. Lee and Perrins came along today, it would be a beautiful ship-shaped plate glass chapel that she would have, wouldn't it? Looking out to the sea, but how spirituality's changed, Here's another sense of from Ruth Bidgood. Again, a sense of profound encounter in and through the natural, and how the natural utters a language which she herself can't articulate for whatever reason. I don't know. Perhaps it's profound grief or anger. She's finding herself not able to speak how she feels, but somehow the natural world expresses this world within her. So it's called Storm. Thank God for the hail, that in its sudden violence on the pane cries for me as I will not cry, shouts what I will not whisper. Thank God for the kite, the great hawk soaring after the storm. He cuts the loneliness I have no words for in characters of flight upon the sky. Two poems now, one by Edward Thomas, and as you know, R.S. Thomas edited a collection of Edward Thomas's poems for Faber, and he talks about how for him Edward Thomas's poetry is so, well, I'm going to use the word prophetic. It's so challenging of the dominant culture, so the hegemony of the scientific world, the industrializing world, the world in which even agriculture itself is losing touch with countryside and with ecology. And he talks about Edward Thomas as someone who goes about the countryside noticing, pays attention. To use that Simone Weil's phrase about prayer, which is so often used also for poems, through prayer, through poetry, we pay attention to the world we see. And one of the poems from Edward Thomas he selected was this poem called Tall Nettles, and it's, in a way, it's a negligible observation of the countryside. You know, what are nettles? You know, and some rusty old machinery. But Edward Thomas, in a sense, reveres that scene as something of beauty. And then Gillian Clark has this poem Nettles in mind as she reflects on nettles in her garden. Tall nettles. Nettles cover up, as they have done these many springs, the rusty harrow, the plough, the long worn out, and the roller made of stone. Only the elm butt tops the nettles now. This corner of the farmyard I like most. As well as any bloom upon a flower, I like the dust on the nettles, never lost, except to prove the sweetness of a shower. Then Gillian Clark, Nettles for Edward Thomas. No machinery, no tangled chains of a harrow locked in rust and rising grasses, nor the fallen stones of ancient habitation where nettles feed on what we leave behind. Nothing but a careless compost heap, warmed to a simmer of sickly pungency, lawn clippings we never mowed but meant to. And can't now, because nettles have moved in, and it's your human words inhabit this. And closer, look, the stems lean with the weight, the young of peacock butterflies just hatched, their glittering black spines and spots of pearl. And I want to say to the dead, look what a poet sings to life. The bite of nettles, caterpillars, wings. I want to say to the dead, look what a poet sings to life. This sense of the living tradition of the language, of the art, speaking through generations. And that in a sense, the vision of a poem is never lost. It's interesting. Stephen Spender's eulogy to T.S. Eliot talks about the more living, the dead. That a poet's work. I suppose we're witnesses to this afternoon and in this festival. A poet's work is never spent when he or she dies, but it lives in the imagination. So again, it's this living force